How you doing? I got my glass of juice with me today. I'd like to talk about the Odyssey. So this past weekend, it just came out. I just went out to see it in the theaters, and I had really no expectations. I mean, other than it obviously being a Nolan film and the typical repertoire that we associate with whatever, oh, it's gonna be nice visuals, good special effects. At the very least, it's gonna be like easy on the eyes, whatever. But to also and like on the content level, like there is a kind of a high bar at least for Christopher Nolan as of late. Although I wasn't a huge fan of Tenet. I didn't really know. And then I mean Travis Scott is in this movie again for some reason, which I think actually might be more significant than I'll talk about. I guess I'll talk about that later. But I should start, I guess, by talking about the what I think Nolan really demonstrates like a very strong awareness of, and kind of as a very major theme behind kind of the ideas and the character of Odysseus and the events of the story and the way his take on Homer's tale, right? I think this is a really a huge thing to kind of undertake. There's so much within this work of literature that is can be extracted, but I really think, and I would praise Nolan for the way he's able to draw out kind of the biggest things, like the most important takeaways that we can glean in this, in our viewing and our reading of the Odyssey and the associated stories of the fall of Troy and all this other literature that Homer that kind of that is adjacent to Homer, and what it is his stories represent for this period of time, this kind of almost historical text in a sense, and at least in a thematic way. I think that we can really read this and take an attitude in the sense of like the time that it was written, and the ideas and the kind of cultural awareness that the Greeks really did have. And I think that for one, like the depiction, I think of the Greek spiritual like relationship, the depiction of the Greek god, the use of the gods, and even the interaction with this notion of a god, in the highest sense. Like what I think this film really gets at the core meaning behind why it is the core of belief, the core of what it is to what it is in the quality of a god that we seek, and how that kind of manifests itself as sort of this like object of desire, the symbolic order which Greek society in which we kind of form our perception of reality around. It takes shape in these kind of gods. And I think to kind of draw on the Lacanian, and like sort of drawing from the work of Zizek as well, in terms of like our perception of God, and the whole and the level of the holy, as it being sort of a means of like what is God really but the lack within ourselves, right? What is a faith, what is a belief but a sort of placement of uncertainty, right? It begins in a place of uncertainty, and it decides to kind of uh, just yeah, it decides to manifest this lack within the embodiment of a divine figure, of a god, to sort of cover over iniquity, or to blanket the notion of uncertainty, to blanket what it is about the unknown qualities of the universe, the indescribable nature of certain phenomena, the things that which we can't quite come to terms with in our human nature, that then begins to manifest itself in the idea of a god, right? I think that it's interesting to take in the character of Odysseus and the presence of like the way that the gods are depicted, right? It's like this is certainly meant to be grounded as like a mythological story. You have the opening line of like, in a time where magic is sort of more widely available, which I think is also an interesting reading of history, right? In the way that we it's easy for us to dismiss these kind of fantastical ideas, or these things, which we can kind of denote as fantasy, on the level of, well, there's nothing in our current day. But it's like, on the level of the discussion of magic, I think, is um, a little bit a little bit it becomes really ironic in the post, and in the way that we consume it nowadays, like the level. But there is really the degree of magic, I think, is a quality that cannot ever really be removed from reality. I think that there's a certain magical, and this is also, how you might designate like a holy, or a sublime kind of quality to life as we know it, and that being a manifest in the form of basically gods, right? In the form of like the natural world. This is how like Athena, right, the reveals herself to Odysseus in the form of this girl who he kills, right? It's more of like a manifestation of that guilty conscience that takes the form of this being, and who speaks to Odysseus on the level of his sort of fundamental trauma, on the level of his kind of personal interaction well, what it is that we're dealing with here, which is the larger concepts of like God and trauma and the notion of the self and the lack within oneself. That it's sort of like these figures and the worship of divine figures almost necessarily comes out of a quality of perceived self lack, like the perception that there is something lacking within you, which is to be filled by a which is and the God, the presence of the holy, or the presence of a God is then meant to fill that lack, to, or at least in the very, or at least in the Christian sense that we know it today, that it then becomes sort of like a meeting of this lack, that the lack is sort of the essential binding thing, which is the quality of human nature. But anyways, all of that is to say, like, I think what this film really tries to get at too is the way that this belief sort of carries onto the construct and the symbolic order of society, right? It sort of is almost, not only is it the lack within the things that we do not know, but it is also sort of the explanation for why the world is the way that it is. In the blank, and at least in the blanketing sense that it sort of just insists upon itself. I mean, this is like a time when, right, when we look at the social order of Greece and these individual kind of kingdoms who are united under this idea of an empire. You have the foundational example, right, of like the mandate, the sort of the holy mandated king. Like, a king is a king not only because he performs the role of a king, but also because of the perception of subjects. The subjects themselves of a kingdom perceive themselves as subject to the king, and in that sense, that it's like everybody on both sides of the relationship, you have a sort of session, like you are in essence performing these roles, right? You are buying into this system out of a, the notion of yourself, right? If, as a subject, right, you perceive a lack in yourself, which is to say that you are not a king. You are not. You do not have any particularly ordained position which grants you, certain privileges and the divine notion of rule, right? And this was, in a sense, like the way that they interacted with this idea. This was sort of the pre-modern notion of, I guess, yeah, like what mandates leadership, what is the condition of a government, what is the condition of a society. But I think that it also points to kind of the grand irony of the entire system, and kind of I think as a counter argument to the sort of the Kantian sense, which, not a huge fan of the guy anyways, but the idea that you can because you must, and the notion of the social contract theory, that it's like people opt into the system out of the necessity of it, right? They perceive the like, if they do not consent to the conditions of their position as subject and king, they do not receive the benefits, and they are not able to participate in the society, which is already exists as it is, and is not it is not open to the possibility of change, the possibility of a radical alternative to that. And so I think this is kind of the point of the film, and the point of Homer's original literature too, is to kind of inspect this thing which takes form in terms of like the law of Zeus, is essentially what they refer to it as, and it becomes reflexive, right, in the sense of like it can also be carried onto the day-to-day behavior and the treatment of individuals, right, in the sense that, like, when that desire, or that the construction, right, of these roles of the myth of power, right, when you buy into the story and the narrative of who is granted power and why, you are in essence almost putting your belief into that system. And so in essence you are then creating gods in their own right, and that is sort of how we have manifest the position of Odysseus. And why that is so unique, right, is that it almost is like he is experiencing this phenomena in like a reverse sense, because it is not as though he is a subject consenting to rule, but rather that he is a subject that insists that he bears the divine responsibility, or some grander, higher responsibility, to be responsible for these men, to be responsible for his kingdom, and to put his duty, in essence, to put his role above his actual above his actual true desires, above his actual self, above who it is he actually perceives himself to be, thinks of himself to be. It's not really clear, I think, ultimately what it is that Odysseus wants. I think that it's something maybe that in itself is kind of the point, is that our desires, the object of our desires, is subject to change upon sort of the experience of them, and the recognition of where it is we are misplacing our responsibility, where we are misplacing our energies, where we are sort of performing roles that do not actually align with us and do not actually define who it is that we are. And to kind of go back to Christopher Nolan's, I think, overall issue with writing women, I think to his credit, he does actually kind of get at the fundamental kernel of I think what is kind of at the root of the notion of this object of desire and how it manifests itself, especially against and especially against the well-being of the women depicted in this film. I think that he really is kind of getting at that the fundamental truth and the ultimate commodification of women in society at this time, as the object cause of desire, as these things which bear in name much more than they actually bear in reality, in the same sense as like a god, in the same sense of an ideal, and that for instance, like Helen of Troy, who's we really only receive a single line of dialogue from, and it is her very strong and frontward like apology of basically for everything that she represents, despite the fact knowing that it has actually nothing to do with who she is. It has nothing to do with who she is fundamentally as a person. We have no window, and I think this is such a great moment. I think that Nolan is able to kind of bring to our attention is that the fact that we know nothing about Helen of Troy is almost the point, is almost the whole idea of what it is that she represents is fundamentally like it's like the essential MacGuffin, the object cause of desire that is simply there for the sake of moving things along, for the sake of justifying this war, for the sake of justifying the conquest and the sacking of Troy, and justifying this bloodlust and this bloodthirst and this deep-seated, I would argue, masculine and patriarchal trauma, which these men are now taking out upon this other society, are taking out upon or aligning with under the what it is Helen of Troy represents for these godlike figures, right? And I think this is kind of, it goes back to the myth of power and the fundamental like notion behind the social contract, and the kind of illusion of any form of government essentially is the session that like you are placing your faith, or you are placing your good faith in the ability of others to rule better than you, or you are ceding to the idea that there is some quality which transcends your own experience, which better aligns with others who are then better suited to make decisions for you, right? And it's like at this time, right, we're sort of presented with this idea in the form of of a divine ordinance, of a sort of God pseudo spiritual justification. But I think that there's an argument to be made here that the contemporary understanding of this is really not any different, more so in the sense that it has really just shifted, in the sense that it's like the quality of what characterizes who is fit to rule as it is today has shifted. And I think this film demonstrates that shift from the notion of a divine ordinance to a kind of meritocratic, I guess, if you want to take a look at like representative democracy, that there is like it's like it becomes that somebody is just more fit to be a representative of a particular party. The alignment becomes more so with the like these higher ideologies of like essentially a performance of morality, a performance of whether you are aligned with a party ideal to justify why it is that you are able to should be voted in for a position. It's like an elevation, right? You place your belief in another figure to make decisions for you. And then on the reverse end, what we see throughout Odysseus' story is this the kind of the panning out of that. What happens to a man with a god complex, essentially, but in the reverse sense of like what is that burden? What is that weight? The unnecessary weight of leadership, that what position does that put a representative in, that is like fundamentally the dilemma is that they are not any better. They are not any better they are not any more fit to represent or to be responsible for an aggregate, for a society, than anybody else. They are fundamentally on a human level, nobody is more or less advantaged or has a objectively more valuable life experience to dictate what the social order ought to be, what society ought to be. And yet Odysseus finds himself in this position. He finds himself bearing the responsibility for all of these people, which neither of them essentially asked for, right? It's kind of the dilemma, the tug of war. It's like does the soldier ask to be spoken for by his general, by a leader? It's like especially in the sense where there are so many countries today where like military conscription is kind of assumed, right? There's like a cultural obligation within these places to serve in the military, and it's sort of like the question is almost preordained, right, to people who come from these types of cultures, where it's like it's not like when the state passes you the you know you're supposed to basically sign your consent to your military conscription. It's like it's not like a it's not really a choice, right? There's not really a freedom in that choice, to the extent that if you opt out, you are essentially opting out from your, ability to partake in that culture, to partake in that society. And so, in the same sense, it's like this is what occurs on the fundamental level. When it comes to, again, social contract theory, the law of Zeus, that these people at this time are buying into this idea that the social order is as it is, and that justification in and of itself is enough to justify and to manifest their desires, their desire for conquest, their desire for warfare. The belief in Odysseus, the idea of Odysseus and what he represents, becomes almost more important than what it is he actually feels like. And this is, I think, is the biggest paradox, the fundamental paradox of like the Trojan horse, right? What that idea represents. And that, like, the guilt, the shame that Odysseus feels is kind of it comes out of this notion that he can't separate his idea and the impact that it has in the world from himself. He is in essence bearing the responsibility, right, of essentially what his gifts, what his abilities have allowed him to accomplish, but only to the end that he is just a cog in the larger machine, only to the end that he is ultimately out of control, or not able to control the human nature, the nature of his men, the nature of the perpetuation of violence, the perpetuation of shared trauma, and this sort of patriarchal domination of others as a means of taking that out, that that essentially transcends what that is in essence the nature, the higher nature of humanity, right, which Odysseus is coming to face with, in the same sense that he comes to face, that these men come to face with the natural order and the sublime sort of sense of of gods, right, of the wrath of Zeus, the wrath of Poseidon. These natural forces are kind of just they're more so reflective of humankind, of their own nature, in essence. It's like these things go hand in hand. The tendency of humanity to dissolve into this sort of these cycles of violence is, in the same sense, is exacted exactly in the same way against them, within the forces of nature and within these things which Odysseus is bearing witness to, as an unfortunate spectator, in that sense. And I think, again, like, to go back to this notion of roles, and I think to look at the character of Penelope, who I think, to her credit, is also, again, very well written and very well just to taken to the furthest extent of like what that like performance, right, the ultimate performance of a role, and the commodification of women in this position, right, as in the same sense as Helen, that Penelope is essence like she becomes confined by her role. It is like it is like she becomes the what it is she represents for the sake of survival. And the real tragedy of her story is not so much the position that she is in when we find her at the beginning of the movie. It is not like she's necessarily threatened by the suitors. She is still, throughout the film, she is still entirely empowered, and still has the ability to dictate for herself, what her future will look like in a very in a resourceful and intelligent and logical way. But it is actually the fact that Odysseus, and then also the sins of the father, also in the sins of the son, she's been abandoned essentially by all the male figures in her life, and basically conscribed to the role that she is asked to play out of that powerlessness, right? It's just like she must become the embodiment of this false role, which she knows, and she has always been aware. I think we can even see this in the conversation that she has with Odysseus before he leaves for his journey. Like, she presents him with the shared objective of this alternative desire. She presents him with this world where they can actually both sort of get what they want, and both sort of be true to who they are, and be true to their desire to run away together, and to live life together, and to share in that love. But I think that this is where Nolan really is able to point out to us, sort of start to poke holes and sort of the flaws in Odysseus's reasoning and the notion of sacrifice. And I think this is really so interesting, right? He brings up to quote or in the description of Agamemnon, right? He's talking sort of like he says that like sacrifice is a test to the man who makes it, or something like that. Basically, like that the power of a sacrifice is, even when it is directed at a god, when it is directed at the higher belief, or when it is sort of performed for the sake of maybe like a transitory thing. Like at the end of the day, the actual value of that sacrifice is born and worn on the one who makes it, in essence, is what he says. And this I think this is like something that really plays out throughout the course of the film, in the sense that like like sacrifice. And then he says, after this, he says that love requires sacrifice, and in a disagreement with Penelope, like he's like, no, love, no, this is something, no, love is something that requires sacrifice, contrary to what Penelope tries to tell him, right? And I think that what this embodies, I feel like, is the lack, right? The lack principle, that sacrifice is something that is only seen as necessary in the retrospective sense, after one has consented to the position that they are in, and consented to these sort of external things which attempt to sort of place and direct their desire, and sort of place and direct the roles that they are meant to fit, the archetype that they are meant to fit within society, that then becomes it becomes even more predominant, right? He is sort of victim to, or Odysseus is victim to this role, to this falsity, this false notion of power, the myth of power, the burden of false responsibility, which Penelope has always been aware of and conscious of, but now is being forced to perform and being forced to embody against the truest nature that she knows, because Odysseus cannot accept this within himself, and because his son can then also not accept this within himself. In the same sense that there's this. This is even another great layer that adds just sort of to the generational trauma, and the way that is transmitted through, from father to son, and in essence plays out almost in a microcosmic kind of way with Tom Holland's character, who I think he was a great casting for that role. I think he did. He's just so good at being helpless. It's like I don't like Mr. Stark. I don't, anyways. So again, fantastic depiction of the female characters. I think, again, the witches too, I think, were so brilliant. Circe and Calypso, who I believe is totally justified in all of her actions. I think that these women actually sort of best represent the most sane reaction. Honestly, it's like as outcasts of society, right? They already recognize the value, and as well as the disadvantages of conceding to what it is, being a part of the social order, being a part of signing the social contract and consenting to being under this. And they have already rejected this, right? This is a notion that they understand, they recognize as counterintuitive to who they truly are, and in that sense, they're able to come to terms with themselves and actually live with, and be very attuned to the realities, the human nature, right? The nature of men, the nature of their violent tendencies to kind of separate themselves. And I think that, again, the tragedy of this too is that Calypso, I feel, is just as much a victim of Odysseus's indecision and Odysseus's misplaced responsibility as is Penelope. I think that these women are both equally victimized by the god complex of Odysseus and his inability to sort of recognize his true desire, his inability to come to terms with the falsity of his position, the looseness of it. And to go back to the notion of the Trojan horse, like that is the Trojan horse as a symbol, I think, represents the fundamental flaw within this ideology, right? The notion of belief, the notion of the sort of the end of good faith, right? The end of good faith relations between societies, so that good faith can exist within society. That ideal has sort of died, in essence, with the idea of Odysseus, playing a trick, being deceptive. But that I feel like is like almost the manifest of like what Odysseus as a character represents. Again, I think, to Nolan's point, like it is sort of the shift, right? It is like what the Trojan horse was able to do to end the Trojan War and to progress history, to accelerate this process of regime change of this massive restructuring of the social order is that it pokes holes in the very law of Zeus, and it's right. This is what Odysseus is aware of, right? He is aware that his choice has disrupted the law of Zeus, and yet he is unable to sort of translate that into the ways that he perceives his own self, his own trauma. In essence, he has destructed the very system which has placed him in the position to even play the trick in the first place. He has destroyed the social order. He has disrupted the good faith, the God could be in any man sort of principle. Again, almost ironically going back to the Kantian like categorical imperative, the notion of doing unto others as you would best do unto you. He has he has broken that the fundamental law, which in this case manifests in the law of Zeus, and so essentially underrides his own foundational beliefs about who he is and the responsibilities that he actually bears. And then we undertake the Odyssey, right? We undertake the journey of his uncovering of this falsity, of his uncovering of all the places in which he has taken upon a false responsibility and a false sense of duty, which are not in fact true to himself. And here I think we get this really interesting introduction to the notion of the subconscious and the notion of the healing of trauma. And I think one of the most striking images to me, I think, to come out of this movie is actually in the sacking of Troy and like what it is that we witness. I just like I remember sitting in the theater and watching the scene and just thinking like, wow, like this is some of like it's just. And I really think this is intentional, that we are meant to kind of see this as this really intense, almost like disturbing, hyper masculine like performance. Like I think that Nolan, at least in the depiction of warfare in this film, like it is not, the violence is never glorified. The violence is never perceived in a way that is like, or is never shot in a way or shown in a way that is like in any way elevated or like in any sense moral. It is almost seen as like this really like traumatic and like it's a perpetuation of violence. And I think that it goes back to this sense of like when it comes down to the root of like exploitation and the root of like the trauma that exists on the European continent that is perpetuated by this. I would argue, or many you could read into like bell hooks and the argument that patriarchy sort of precedes the nature of corrupt government, the nature of warfare in itself, the nature of conquest. That it arises from this fundamental insecurity. Again, going back to our the Lacanian like notion of the lack, right? The perceived lack, the lack in oneself, the lack of ability to be in tune with one's own identity, that then manifests itself with this sort of like in this bloodthirsty desire and this desire for conquest in a sense where these men essentially feel out of control. They feel I almost like it really did make me think to the current like atmosphere of like the manosphere and like red pill content, and these kind of pipeline that almost creates to the military industrial complex. Like I thought that this is such an interesting phenomenon. Like I really think there is something to looking at the toxic masculinity and the effects of it on ancient Greek society. Like we really don't think about the sort of dark age virtue that these societies are governed by as being a product of patriarchal society, of the law of Zeus, right? Of this social order, which designates for no particular reason other than that it is what it is. That this is the way that societies ought to function. That this is the cycle of the violence that ought to be perpetuated. And I think that Odysseus bearing witness to, for example, Cinna, and what Cinna represents is that belief, right? The consequences of that belief. That in essence, you need somebody to believe, right, in a cause in order for these things, in order for these systems to facilitate themselves and to, organize and construct themselves. But that comes at a cost, right? It always comes at a cost of those who believe and those who must be convinced, right? And must be in a sense deluded, right? Duped in that sense, right? Going back to the idea that the soldier does not ask to be spoken for, more so that they are just a product of their time and place, and that they're then used and co-opted by this desire, by this conquest, right? This traumatic cycle to perform this masculinity, to perform these grand overturnings of society. I think too. again, going back to the notion of like contemporary military industrial complex and the draw that that has on like disaffected young men. I think in particular, like especially when we think about the the engineering pipelines in America, the sort of hyper empirical like and the hyper scientific but also highly apolitical, right? Pipeline of like higher engineering and higher sciences to funnel directly into the military industrial complex. And I think that we really should inspect like the ways that like the consequences of toxic masculinity and the consequences of patriarchy almost fuel the war machine, like almost directly, right? At least that is can be seen and can be shown, I think, the best in some of the scenes of the Odyssey, but I think can be carried to the modern day. And I think when we think of the Trojan horse and like the idea of it and what it represents in the sense of like of as a war technology, right? That in essence, war and this is sort of the notion of war is just hunting with stealth. The cruelty of it, the fundamental like the competitive nature is essentially to out trick the other, to subvert the other's humanity, right? At the most in the most inhumane way, and whoever is the most inhumane essentially wins. Whoever is the most totally destructive, explosive, and outwardly destructive and violent is what determines war, is what ends wars in essence. Think Nagasaki, think Hiroshima. This is the reasoning, the logic that has insisted upon itself to within war technology, right? Within the escalation of it, it becomes a war of escalation, right? It's like these things kind of just perpetuate themselves, right? For the sake of being more outrageously violent, being more. I think the words that come to mind are explosive, explosive, quick, and unexpected. And I think there is an alternative reading to this notion, the overturning the fall of Troy, right, and the fall of the social order too, at least in the revolutionary sense, which I think is very interesting, at least when it comes to the way that we sort of frame history, right, and the way that we frame, history as something that is written by the winners and the nature of regime change. That like these things are kind of always characterized, at least in the struggle, right, at least in the stages of the 10 years in between all the battles that happened prior to the falling of Troy, as sort of like history writing itself in a retroactive sense. That like the revolution is something that occurs at these precise moments of the unexpected, in a very explosive and almost like unpredictable nature, right? That there is like there is like a subversiveness, right? It is almost necessary for this opportune moment to arise in order for regime to change, in order for things to fall. And that is sort of the scary thing, right? Is the gap, right? It is the falling out of the old social order, of the old symbolic order, and what it is replaced with, right? That is so scary, right? That is that is what Odysseus is essentially haunted by. Is that, what if the one is only coming to replace the other, and this being sort of the cycle, the perpetuation of violence. But when we think in terms of revolution and what alternatively that can do, I think that looking at the nature of how societies have changed in the past and the opportunity that this provides for the paradigm shift, right? Because even though what we could see is less so a subversion of dark age virtue and the perpetuation of toxic masculinity, and more so just a transfer, right, of the notion of what virtue is and what the divine ordinance of society is to rule, transferred sort of to a more democratic sense of the will of the people, right? The will of the in essence, you are transferring your faith, right? Your faith in institutions, from your faith in God to your faith in the people, in essence, to your faith in a collective, in a government. But in effect, it still takes place it takes shape in the same way. These normative forces still are co-opting your desire to participate and to buy into the myth of society, to buy into this idea that actually these things are necessary because they are. And we forget, right? We forget in our reading of history, in our reading of regime change, in our reading of revolutions, the way the quality that this has, the opportunity that this presents for the revolutionary, for the people like Odysseus, right? I think in essence, the counter argument to this is that history is not only written by the winners but also by the literate, and that the existence of the Odyssey and sort of the whole purpose of Homer's writing is to provide for us the lessons of this time, the self-reflection of that. And Odysseus himself as a character essentially represents the healing of this trauma, the subject who undergoes the work, right? The healing to actually process, what it is he is a product of, how it is these systems have exacted a toll on his body, on his mind, and then come to terms with what it is about his higher nature that he has become out of touch with. And I think this is why at the conclusion of the film there is such an emphasis on on his name, and the I think the significance of like his arrival and his laying low, right, and the dissolution of, he's essentially detached from his identity, right? He is detached from everything that the name Odysseus once carried. He has detached himself from the responsibilities that this once bore upon who he is, and he is able to move as a free agent, as a free actor within the society, and he's able to then return in the fullness of who he knows he is and what he knows he wants, to actually achieve what it is he has always needed to actually come to terms with, in terms of caring for his family, caring for his lover, caring for, remedying his relationship with himself and with his trauma, and curing, in essence, the thirst for conquest, the thirst for the continual buying into this social order, this system, which really only seeks to insist upon itself and to totalize its own legitimacy in every sense. So yeah, I think that's sort of my reading of the Odyssey, the hero's journey, and what that kind of represents. I think that he is definitely I think we should be careful to Odysseus undergoes a lot of growth, and it's like there are so many key moments that point out how flawed of a character he is, right, in terms of like his sort of rejection and his lack of awareness, right, of other people, of other people's of what human nature is, right. I think there you can even carry the allegory of the Trojan horse to the story of the Cyclops, right? And because we do discover that the Cyclops is actually a sentient being that they could have reasoned with, right? That they could have talked to, and yet Odysseus is so quick to dismiss this, right? He is so quick to dismiss and reject the natural order, right? The appeal to Poseidon, right? It's like he's the son of Poseidon. The appeal to like the spiritual, the law of Zeus, right? He is already in essence subverting that as well, and by failing to treat this creature, to treat this sentient being who is also a part of the natural world with equal credence as himself, as his fellow men. And so again, just it goes back to the theme of hunting and the difference between is hunting for sport and like can it become remedial, and that healing process, the importance of that process for Odysseus's journey, I think is so paramount to what the story I think is trying to tell. And yeah, again, just like the very toxic nature of the war machine, the toxic nature of how history is written, how we the myth of, I think that the myth of power is likewise associated with the myth of progress, in the same sense that every time societies change, right, because all they really do is change. It is like as much as that may manifest itself and may take shape in certain technologies, it's like we always need to be asking ourselves what is being lost here in this transaction, what is being left behind in essence. And for Odysseus bearing the representative of that change, he is really coming to terms with everything that he must leave behind within this law of Zeus, within this attachment, this deep-seated attachment he has within his identity to the roles and to the function which he once thought he played within society, to then actually come to terms with who he is, what he wants, and how he can actually be able to move autonomously in a world which too often defines to constrict us to labels, to constrict us to archetypes and identities, and to the social order, right? I think it is a fundamental rejection of the Kantian notion of what it is to participate in society, that actually we do not we do not have to because we must, but actually by not buying into that, we actually are able to free ourselves from the limiting beliefs that society places on us. And that in itself is a very long process. And I think that this film does a good job of essentially taking us through the entire journey, this sort of subconscious desire to resolve this trauma. And I think that it's so interesting too, like the nature of the Odyssey, the way that the decision is first, right, to just differentiate from Agamemnon. But it later, as the journey progresses, it begins to sort of reveal that Odysseus actually has this subconscious desire to resolve these things, to actually discover who he is. And I think that, the function of Calypso and that whole process of the time that he spends there is so representative of, what it means to actually absolve ourselves of desire, to discover what it is that we truly want through the pursuit of things that we realize we actually don't. And like, that is the whole value of the hero's journey. That is the value of almost the object of desire, right, which is placed in this case in Calypso, and also in the Lotus Flower, which I thought was interesting too, and like the separation of the mind and body, that the body can sort of function and carry things independent of the mind, and that simultaneously the mind can sort of dictate its own trauma response. That there can be a level of detachment from the suffering of the body from the suffering of the mind, and that at the same time these things are both intertwined, that the one must follow the other, that the subconscious desire of the body, that the things that materialize and the cycles that are perpetuated that bear power over our actual physical form will manifest themselves in the mind, and we will have to confront, in essence, right, the demons of our desire, the consequences of what it is to exist in a society that tells you to desire one thing, and yet which you are not, you haven't quite decided or haven't quite realized or actualized. What about that? What about that society? What about that idea, that belief is actually really just a lack in yourself, a lack of understanding in who it is that and again, going back to the idea that God is, that in essence, that God and that the dissociation of control is a denial of one's own power, a denial of one's, or like, a manifestation of one's own lack. That in healing our traumas and in recognizing the power within ourselves to actually dictate our own lives, we are able to become autonomous beings within society. We are able to become autonomous to our desire, and we are able to subvert whatever it is the law of Zeus constrains over the roles that we are meant to play within society. That being said, the caveat to this is, of course, again, going back to the depiction of women and women figures, like at least in Greek society at this time, an awareness of this was simply not enough for these characters, right? That's why Odysseus' decision is so impactful, is that he actually does have people that depend on him in this sense, at least in the familial unit. Which I think could be problematic in essence, but community at the base level, I think we should maybe more so align that with. It's not the family in particular, but more so the direct community, right? The direct level of care that you have with those in your community, that you should actually sort of be catered. You should be your fundamental orientation, right? It should not be towards this the myth of the state, which is not to say that these things obviously these things are real. They are actualized in the sense that the form follows the idea. But again, recognizing that without the consent of an individual to believe themselves to be a part of the state, there is no actual state. There is no actual physical manifest. There are only symptoms of this idea and this sort of mass cultural identity, which people assign themselves to out of a lack of out of their own perceived lack in their own ability to self-determine and their ability to be sovereign and to demonstrate sovereignty in the sense of being able to reject these cycles and sort of partake in that healing and partake in the resolution and the closing of loops and the these cycles which become cemented as necessary, but which are really only cycles of trauma and cycles of violence within society. So those are my thoughts on what the film sort of deals with, and I think there's so much here. Needless to say, the visuals were amazing, but I felt that honestly that was just way more fun to chew on the ideas and really kind of get back and forth. I think if there's anything that I sort of take from this, it's the notion of when he speaks to his son towards the end of the movie, talking about, yeah, don't look for God in other men. The sort of death of good faith and everything that his knowledge sort of represents as a character, it sort of becomes actually, an awareness of like not idolizing anybody, right? Not that there's a sort of balance between, well, naivete, right, and sort of blind faith, as opposed to the actual awareness of one's position within society, to recognize that we are all playing roles, recognize that we are all in sense in performance, right? We are in performance of of this social system, of the symbolic order, which has been projected onto us, but is not necessarily of us, is not necessarily of our true nature, our true qualities. And Odysseus is when he's confronted with that, he is at first in denial, but he recognizes that everybody is bound to their own nature, and it is actually becoming more in tune with that than just sort of allowing your desire to be co-opted by the perpetuation of society, of these cycles of war, etc. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought of the movie. Let me know if you have anything to add. I really thirst. I'm gonna take a sip of this. But yeah, that's basically it. Yeah, I kind of did. I also wanted to. I guess I'll close with this last thought. On the discussion of like the level of God, and like the manifestation of and the importance of sacrifice. I remember I wanted to expand on this a little bit more too, and sort of why it's not okay. I think of the story. There's a biblical story in terms of Solomon, right? And even I know the Christian conception of God in that sense is a little bit different from the Greek one, but I think that the story is nonetheless relevant to this conversation, that essentially King Solomon defies the will of God, right? And he is in conquest of another kingdom, and he is directed to carry things out in a particular manner, but he instead chooses to do things contrary to that, contrary to how things have been outlined for him, and so instead decides to sacrifice a number of, basically, the spoils of war. He sacrifices a good majority of them to the Hebrew God, and then in that sense expects to be absolved of this disobedience. He expects to instead his sacrifice to be an atonement of his actions, but actually he's met with the response from God, then who speaks to him, at least in the story, and communicates to him. I forget if it's directly or through the prophets, that essentially the order is, to obey is better than sacrifice, and that's not to say that sacrifice is useless, right? To the extent of like what it is that God here, whatever that represents to you, or whatever that represents to a given social context. But like, yeah, that it is not the same. It is not the ultimate. Like it's an excess in essence, right? To go back to what Odysseus says at the beginning about sacrifice being an attest to the man who makes it. In essence, it doesn't actually do anything. It's not as though our concept of God, or a concept of God, needs anything, from us, right? It is not as though like our lack necessarily fulfills anything within a concept, within the notion of a God, of a higher power. But actually that it is better, and actually to obey in the sense. And I recognize in this story, right, it is like the obedience, right, the command of God is already kind of preordained. Like it's already accessible. It's made clear to King Solomon, right, what it is that he has to do, and yet he goes against it anyways. But if we carry this to sort of how this could be taken to represent other things, the story of Odysseus in particular, it's like obedience is more so an obedience to a fundamental desire, right? It is like sort of the obedience to oneself, and like seeing the good one ought to do and choosing not to do it, right? In that sense, that like we all sort of have a subconscious desire, and for Odysseus this manifests like his desire to heal this trauma, and to actually resolve his like false position, and like that our obedience to these desires is actually more honorable than our sacrifice to a false idea of who it is that we are or what it is that we are pursuing, right? Because it's like when we become too attached to like what that is meant to represent, when it becomes sort of like an like a material attest, like something that we are in essence trying to prove to ourselves, right? Prove to ourselves the validity of our belief, when actually it should actually come from a more intuitive and more self-attuned notion of like what one's destiny is, a notion of where one is meant to be, right? And this is the tricky thing, right? It's like for it, when translating the direct command of God to this story, it's more so it's not necessarily a direct command so much as a subconscious desire, right? And in the same, and they actualize themselves in the same way because they are equally overbearing, right? They are equally inescapable to the character of Solomon and to the character of Odysseus in both cases, where like they know that they cannot necessarily escape judgment, or they cannot escape the destiny of the trajectory of what that lack within themselves has sort of how it has manifested. And so like I think what these stories are trying to argue is that the measure of sacrifice is only really useful to in a reflective sense, in a retroactive sense, where one does not actually need the affirmation of what one is and what one believes so much as it is a ritualistic sort of appreciation for what one has been. And I think that this is the ultimate use is that when the sacrifice actually becomes useful in the story of the Odyssey is in order to commune with the dead, in order to commune with the almost the ego sense, right? The false sense of what Odysseus represented to all the people that once followed him, who once believed in him, and that sacrifice is in essence like a communion with, that everything that belief comes to represent, everything that belief, and that guilt, right? That the burden of that guilt that is born on Odysseus comes to manifest itself within the dead bodies of these fallen soldiers, within the unresolved grudges of these people who he has taken upon the responsibility for. And so, yeah, in essence, that sacrifice is not something that we should look, in however way you interpret it, right? Self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of love, the sacrifice of if it is in a religious context, that it is never the ultimatum of of belief of oneself. It is only actually like it is only really a performance of what one has, like almost like a checkpoint in essence to kind of reassure oneself of one's own position, to remind oneself of what your actions constitute within your own life. And sometimes that is useful to confront, but it can also then it also bears the risk of becoming transitory and becoming transactional, as a means of sort of escapism, right? Of one's true, of one's true destiny, of who one is actually meant to be. And this is dragged on quite long, but I think I finally got to everything that I wanted to talk about. So hopefully this is interesting to you. Sorry for the length, but yeah. And now I have juice. So have a good night and see the movie you haven't. Shit, I didn't put spoilers at the beginning, did I? But whatever. If you made it this far, I'm assuming you've probably watched the movie, or you don't care to at any time in the future, and maybe this is still a valuable thing for you, but who knows? Anyways, peace out.